The chapel was thick with grief and solemnity, every heart heavy with the weight of loss. The folded American flag, symbol of sacrifice and honor, was meant to be presented to the general's family waiting expectantly in the front row. Rows of polished metals glinted in the dim light. The widow's black veil trembled with silent sorrow. Yet, the honor guard didn't stop there. Instead, they marched past them all, steady and unyielding, until they reached the back where a lone figure sat apart from the crowd. The man's shoulders sagged beneath a faded suit, his face a roadmap of years no one dared to imagine. To the watching crowd, he was a stranger, a shadow among the living memories gathered to pay respect. A murmur rippled through the chapel. Whispers grew into uneasy questions. Had someone made a terrible mistake? Was the flag being handed to the wrong person? But beneath the silence, an untold story lingered, one that no medal or ceremony could capture. This old man wasn't just a stranger. He was the keeper of a secret, a witness to sacrifices the world had forgotten. And as the flag was carefully placed in his hands, the truth began to unravel. Sometimes, the deepest bonds of honor lie hidden in unexpected places, beyond rank and recognition. As his trembling hands received the flag, memories surged like distant echoes, foxholes under moonlight, promises whispered between brothers in arms, and the bloodied hands of a man who once saved a young soldier destined to become a general. No one knew that behind this forgotten face was the man who had pulled the general from death's grip decades ago, refusing recognition, walking away from medals. And now, in this final gesture, a silent debt was paid, not by the military, but by the soul of a man who never forgot the one who made life possible. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this deeply moving story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this community. Arlington National Cemetery had witnessed thousands of military funerals, but this one felt different from the moment the first guests arrived. General Robert Morrison's service was scheduled for 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late September. The leaves were just beginning to turn, casting golden shadows across the pristine rows of white headstones that stretched endlessly in every direction. Morrison had been a three-star general, a decorated Vietnam veteran, and a man whose military career spanned 4 decades of service to his country. The chapel filled early. Morrison's widow, Margaret, sat in the front pew flanked by their 2 sons, both colonels in their own right. Behind them, rows of high-ranking officers filled the seats, their dress blues immaculate, their ribbons telling stories of campaigns across multiple continents. Secretary of Defense officials occupied the third row. Senators and congressmen who had worked with Morrison on military appropriations sat nearby. The chapel buzzed with the quiet conversations of people who moved in circles of power and influence. But there was something else in the air that morning, something the dignitaries couldn't quite place. Several of the honor guard members kept glancing toward the back of the chapel, their eyes settling on a lone figure who seemed entirely out of place among the assembled crowd. He was elderly, probably in his 70s, with silver hair that needed cutting and hands that bore the calluses of manual work. His suit was clean but worn, the kind purchased decades ago for occasions that didn't come often. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the flag-draped casket at the front of the chapel. Most of the guests noticed him at some point during the service. A few assumed he was a groundskeeper who had been allowed to observe. Others thought perhaps he was a distant relative from Morrison's childhood, someone from the small Iowa town where the general had grown up. A congressman's wife whispered to her husband that the man looked like he might be lost, that perhaps someone should check if he belonged there. But no one approached him. There was something about his bearing, despite his humble appearance, that suggested he had every right to be exactly where he was. The service proceeded with military precision. Chaplain Williams delivered a eulogy that touched on Morrison's distinguished career, his leadership during some of the military's most challenging operations, and his dedication to the families of fallen soldiers. He spoke of Morrison's work establishing scholarships for military children and his tireless advocacy for veteran services. The general's eldest son spoke briefly about his father's commitment to duty and family. A fellow general shared memories of Morrison's tactical brilliance, and his ability to inspire loyalty in even the most difficult circumstances. Throughout it all, the man in the back remained motionless. He didn't take notes. He didn't wipe away tears. He simply listened with the focused attention of someone absorbing every word, as if each detail mattered in ways the rest of the congregation couldn't understand. When the congregation sang Amazing Grace, his lips moved silently along with the familiar words. During the moments of prayer, his head bowed with a reverence that seemed to run deeper than ceremony. As the service moved toward its conclusion, Margaret Morrison shifted nervously in her seat. She knew what came next. The honor guard would remove the flag from her husband's casket, fold it with the sacred precision that had been performed at military funerals for generations, and present it to her as the surviving spouse. It was a moment she had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The flag would become a tangible connection to Robert's service, something she could hold when the grief threatened to overwhelm her. The honor guard approached the casket with measured steps. 8 men in dress uniforms moved as one unit, their movements synchronized through countless hours of practice. They lifted the flag from the casket and began the ceremonial folding. Each fold was performed with deliberate care, transforming the full-sized flag into the traditional triangle with only the blue field of stars visible. The chapel fell silent except for the soft whisper of fabric moving against fabric. Margaret Morrison straightened in her seat, preparing to receive the flag that would honor her husband's memory. Her sons, both decorated officers themselves, flanked her protectively. The assembled dignitaries watched respectfully, many having participated in similar ceremonies for their own fallen comrades. This was the moment that would provide closure, the final act that would transition Robert Morrison from active service to honored memory. But something unexpected happened. Instead of approaching the front pew where Margaret waited, the honor guard detail turned toward the back of the chapel. 8 men in perfect formation marched past the widow, past the family, past the senators and generals and dignitaries. Their destination was the lonely figure in the worn suit who had sat in silence throughout the entire service. The murmuring started immediately. Margaret Morrison's face showed confusion, then hurt, then something approaching anger. Her sons exchanged glances, uncertain whether to stand, whether to object, whether this was some kind of unprecedented military protocol they didn't understand. The dignitaries shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few people stood to get a better view of what was happening, creating a ripple of movement through the chapel. The honor guard sergeant approached the elderly man with the same precision he would have shown to any general or dignitary. He extended the folded flag and spoke the traditional words that accompany this most sacred of military honors. The man accepted the flag with hands that trembled slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from the weight of a moment 45 years in the making. The chapel erupted in confused whispers. Margaret Morrison half rose from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and incomprehension. One of her sons placed a gentle hand on her arm, but his own expression showed he was equally bewildered. A retired admiral in the fourth row leaned forward as if to protest. Several guests pulled out their phones, wondering if they were witnessing some kind of military scandal that would make headlines. Chaplain Williams stepped forward to the podium, his face calm despite the obvious tension filling the chapel. He waited for the murmuring to subside, then spoke in the clear, carrying voice that had comforted countless grieving families over his decades of service. "I can see that many of you are confused by what just occurred," he began. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to assure you that this was done according to your husband's explicit wishes, outlined in instructions he left with me 3 months ago when his illness took a turn for the worse." The chaplain paused, allowing his words to settle over the congregation. Margaret Morrison remained standing, her face a mixture of hurt and confusion. Her sons flanked her protectively, but their own expressions showed they were struggling to understand what was happening. "General Morrison asked me to explain something to all of you today," the chaplain continued. "He wanted you to know about a promise made 45 years ago in a jungle in Vietnam. A promise that shaped the rest of his life and the lives of everyone in his family." The chapel grew quieter as people leaned forward to hear the chaplain's words. Even those who had been reaching for their phones to document what they assumed was a military protocol error now sat in focused attention. "The man holding the flag is Sergeant First Class Charlie Cooper," Chaplain Williams announced. "In 1978, Charlie was serving alongside a young Lieutenant Robert Morrison in what would become one of the most dangerous operations of the Vietnam conflict. Their unit was pinned down for 3 days in hostile territory. Food was running out. Medical supplies were gone. Several men were wounded, and it looked like none of them would make it home. The chaplain's voice carried the weight of a story that had waited decades to be told. Margaret Morrison slowly sank back into her seat, her anger replaced by something approaching understanding. Around the chapel, the dignitaries and family members sat in complete silence. On the second night, when it seemed certain they wouldn't survive, Lieutenant Morrison and Sergeant Cooper made a pact. The chaplain continued. If something happened to one of them, the survivor would watch over the other's family. They shook hands in a muddy foxhole while enemy fire whistled overhead. 2 young men making a promise they hoped they'd never have to keep. Charlie Cooper remained seated in the back row, the folded flag resting on his lap, his weathered hands holding it with the reverence of someone who understood its true meaning. His eyes were fixed on the chaplain, but his expression suggested he was seeing something beyond the chapel walls, remembering a jungle and a promise and a moment that had changed everything. Charlie kept that promise, Chaplain Williams said, his voice growing stronger. For 45 years, he kept that promise. When General Morrison's first son was born, Charlie was there in the hospital waiting room. When the Morrison family moved to different military bases, Charlie found ways to stay in touch. When Morrison's eldest son struggled in high school, Charlie drove 600 miles to attend his graduation. When Morrison's youngest son was deployed to Afghanistan, Charlie wrote him letters every week. Around the chapel, people began to understand. Margaret Morrison's face had transformed from confusion to recognition to something approaching awe. She was remembering now, remembering the quiet man who had appeared at family gatherings over the years, the one who sent birthday cards to her children, the one who had helped her husband repair their deck when Robert's back injury prevented him from doing the work himself. Charlie never asked for recognition. The chaplain continued. He never told anyone about the promise he'd made. He simply showed up, year after year, decade after decade. He was at Little League games and school plays and graduation ceremonies. He was there during Robert's recovery from his first heart attack. He was there when Robert received his stars, standing in the back of the ceremony, proud but never seeking attention. The elderly man in the back row hadn't moved, but tears were now visible on his weathered cheeks. The flag seemed to grow heavier in his hands, not from its physical weight, but from the accumulated weight of 45 years of quiet faithfulness. General Morrison told me that Charlie Cooper was more than a battle buddy, Chaplain Williams said. He was the brother he'd never had, the man who taught him that honor wasn't about ribbons or promotions or recognition. It was about keeping your word, especially when no one was watching, especially when it wasn't convenient, especially when it cost you something. Margaret Morrison stood again, but this time her movement was different. She wasn't confused or angry. She was walking toward the back of the chapel, toward the man who had been part of her family's life for so long that she'd stopped questioning why he was always there. Her sons followed, understanding finally dawning on their faces. Charlie never married. The chaplain continued as the Morrison family made their way through the chapel. He said he was too busy keeping his promise to Robert. He worked construction jobs and saved his money so he could travel to be present for the important moments in the Morrison family's life. He never missed a birthday, never forgot an anniversary, never failed to show up when he was needed. Margaret Morrison reached the back row where Charlie Cooper sat. She extended her hands toward him, not to take the flag, but to help him stand. When he rose, she embraced him with the warmth of someone greeting a family member, which, in every way that mattered, he was. General Morrison's final instruction to me was this, Chaplain Williams said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. He wanted Charlie to receive the flag because Charlie had already received everything else. The trust, the love, the brotherhood that flag represents. Robert Morrison died knowing his family had been watched over, protected, and loved by a man who asked for nothing in return except the privilege of keeping his word. Charlie Cooper finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion and decades of unspoken gratitude. I promised Bobby I'd take care of his family, he said simply. It was the easiest promise I ever made to keep. The chapel erupted not in confused murmuring, but in spontaneous applause. Dignitaries who had initially been offended by the breach of protocol now understood they had witnessed something far more significant than military ceremony. They had seen brotherhood in its purest form. They had seen what it meant to keep faith across decades, to honor a promise when no one was watching, to love a family as if it were your own. Margaret Morrison stood beside Charlie Cooper, her arm linked through his, as if she were finally acknowledging publicly what had been true privately for 45 years. He wasn't a stranger who had somehow ended up at her husband's funeral. He was family. He was the man who had helped raise her sons, who had been present for every significant moment of their lives, who had loved them with the quiet consistency that had allowed them to take his presence for granted. The honor guard, understanding now the significance of what they had just performed, rendered a crisp salute to Charlie Cooper. Not because of his rank, which had never progressed beyond sergeant, but because of his character, which had elevated him beyond any military hierarchy. Charlie, still holding the flag, returned the salute with the precision of a man who had never forgotten his training, never abandoned his commitment to honor. As the service concluded and people began to file out of the chapel, many stopped to shake Charlie's hand or to thank him for his decades of service to the Morrison family. Some of the highest-ranking officials in attendance waited in line to meet the man who had just received one of the military's highest honors, not for what he had done in battle, but for what he had done in the years of peace that followed. Charlie Cooper walked out of Arlington National Cemetery that day carrying more than a folded flag. He carried the public acknowledgement of a life lived in service to others, of promises kept when keeping them was difficult, of love expressed through presence rather than words. He had entered the chapel as someone most people assumed was a stranger. He left as someone everyone understood was family. The story of Charlie Cooper and Robert Morrison spread beyond that chapel, beyond that cemetery, beyond that day. It became a reminder that the most profound acts of heroism often happen not in moments of dramatic crisis, but in the quiet consistency of showing up, year after year, when someone needs you. It became a testament to the truth that brotherhood isn't defined by shared blood or common experience alone, but by shared commitment to something greater than yourself. Margaret Morrison kept in touch with Charlie after the funeral, finally understanding the depth of his sacrifice and the breadth of his love for her family. She learned about the jobs he had turned down because they would have taken him too far from the Morrison family. She discovered the savings account he had maintained for decades to ensure he could always afford to travel to their important events. She realized that the man she had taken for granted had structured his entire life around keeping a promise made in a jungle 45 years earlier. Charlie Cooper never sought recognition for what he had done. He had simply done what he believed was right, what he had promised to do, what love looked like when it was expressed through action rather than sentiment. The flag that was presented to him that day became not just a symbol of military service, but a symbol of faithfulness itself, of the kind of character that keeps promises across decades, of the kind of love that shows up consistently, whether anyone notices or not. Sometimes heroism wears a uniform and carries a weapon and performs acts of dramatic courage under fire. But sometimes heroism wears a faded suit and sits quietly in the back row and keeps promises that no one else remembers making. Sometimes the greatest act of service isn't what you do in a moment of crisis, but what you do in all the ordinary moments that follow, when the cameras are gone and the audience has departed and there's no one left to applaud except the people whose lives you've quietly transformed through your presence. Charlie Cooper understood something that many people spend their entire lives trying to learn, that true brotherhood isn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It's about showing up consistently, caring persistently, and loving unconditionally, even when no one is keeping score. It's about making promises that cost you something to keep and keeping them anyway, because your word matters more than your comfort. The flag that Charlie received that day represented more than Robert Morrison's military service. It represented the kind of friendship that transcends time and circumstance, the kind of commitment that shapes entire families across generations, the kind of love that asks nothing for itself while giving everything it has. It represented the truth that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with presence, not in foreign countries, but in the daily lives of people who need to know they're not alone. In a world that often confuses celebrity with significance, noise with importance, recognition with worth, Charlie Cooper's story stands as a reminder that the most meaningful lives are often the quietest ones. The people who make the biggest difference are frequently the ones whose names never appear in headlines, whose faces never grace magazine covers, whose stories are told only at funerals when someone finally takes the time to explain why that person in the back row mattered more than anyone realized. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who showed up consistently, who kept promises when keeping them was difficult, who loved you with the quiet persistence that you might have taken for granted. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their faithfulness shaped your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.